When I was younger, my life felt like a carefully composed symphony. Everything had its place, the joyful, fast-paced moments and the slow, quiet stretches of peace. My husband, John, was like a conductor, and together we created harmony. We would laugh over shared memories, and even in silence, we were in sync, two parts of a greater whole. At that time, I was sure that life would continue like this, each day flowing seamlessly into the next. But as time passed, the music of our life began to fade. The once vibrant moments, once filled with the resonance of our shared laughter and dreams, grew softer, quieter, and eventually, almost imperceptible. I remember the first time I truly noticed it. It was a Sunday evening, and John came home late, his face drawn, his movements mechanical. He didn't even notice the sunset outside the window, and that's when I realized the music had started to disappear. The silence between us grew thicker with every passing day. We still exchanged words, but they felt hollow, like background noise. His work had consumed him entirely, and I had started to feel like a distant observer in my own life. We no longer shared our little rituals, the small gestures that once held so much meaning. The joy we once found in each other's presence was now buried beneath the weight of routine. I longed for the melody that had once filled our home, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find it. What remained was a silence, a quiet void where once there had been music, and I didn't know how to fill it. John's schedule became predictable, almost like clockwork. He would leave early in the morning, barely a word exchanged, and return late, dragging his tired body into the house with no more energy left for anything but the barest of interactions. Our home, once a sanctuary, felt more like a place we simply passed through. His eyes, once so full of spark and curiosity, now looked dulled by exhaustion. And I, too, had become caught in the current of routine. I found myself following the same patterns day after day, without thinking much of it. We ate dinner in silence most nights. The sound of silverware clinking against plates was the only music that played, but it was a distant, hollow kind of sound. Sometimes I would try to engage him in conversation, asking about his day or telling him about mine, but his responses were automatic, as if he were speaking through a fog. I no longer felt the need to press for deeper connection. It was enough to just sit across from him, but with each passing day, the gap between us widened, like a chasm that neither of us was willing to bridge. There were no more late-night talks about our hopes, no more laughter over inside jokes, no more shared moments of joy. Instead, there were just the motions, the habits, the expectations. The life we had built together had turned into a series of mechanical actions, and we were both stuck in it, unable or unwilling to escape. I would catch myself staring at him sometimes, watching him as he read or worked on his laptop, and I would wonder how we had gotten here. How had we let our love, our connection, slip away so easily? There were no answers, only the quiet rhythm of our lives continuing on, unchanging and ever so predictable. I wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words never came. It seemed as though we had both resigned ourselves to this silent, unfeeling existence, and deep inside, I felt myself slipping away too. One evening, as I stood on the balcony, the cool air brushing against my skin, I found myself staring out at the horizon, trying to clear my mind. The day had been long, and the house had felt more suffocating than usual. It was one of those moments when everything around you seems to be moving, but you're standing still, stuck in a place where time drags and nothing changes. I needed something, anything, to shake me out of this numbness. And then I heard it. At first it was a soft murmur, barely audible, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was the sound of a guitar. The notes were slow and deliberate, filling the air with a warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't loud or brash, it was gentle, almost tender, as though the music itself was reaching out, calling to something deep inside me. I turned my head to the neighboring house where the light from the window flickered softly, casting a dim glow across the night. It was coming from there. The music swirled in the air surrounding me, making the space between my chest and my ribs feel lighter, more alive. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the melody wash over me. It had been so long since anything had moved me like this. I didn't know who lived in the house next door, a neighbor I had never met, someone anonymous in my quiet little corner of the world. But in that instant, I felt as if I knew them, as if the music tied me to them even though I had no idea who they were. The guitar played on, and in the stillness of that evening, I realized that I had been starved for something, for feeling, for connection, for life itself. And that music? It stirred something in me I had almost forgotten existed. I didn't know what to do with the feeling. It was new, unexpected, and it left me yearning for more. What was it about that simple guitar played by a stranger that had touched me so deeply? I didn't have answers, but in that moment the silence in my own life seemed unbearable in comparison to the music that now echoed in my ears. I stayed there, on the balcony, as the last notes faded into the night, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt something inside me stir. The next day, I found myself restless, pacing around the house as if the music from the night before had left an imprint I couldn't shake. I hadn't meant to go outside, but something inside me urged me to step out just to breathe. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe I was chasing that feeling, that spark of life that the guitar had ignited in me, or maybe I just needed a break from the suffocating routine. As I stepped out into the yard, I saw him, the man who played the guitar. He was standing by his mailbox, his figure framed by the soft light of the afternoon. He didn't notice me at first, but as I walked closer, our eyes met, and for a brief moment, everything around us seemed to fade away. There was a quiet recognition in his gaze, as though he knew me in a way I couldn't explain, even though we had never spoken before. He smiled, and I felt a jolt run through me. It wasn't an ordinary smile. It was warm, genuine, and somehow made me feel like the world was a little bit smaller, a little less lonely. His presence was different, unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the connection I felt, but the way his eyes lingered on me told me that I hadn't. "Hi," he said, his voice smooth and steady, with a hint of curiosity. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Hi," I replied, a little breathless, as if I had been caught off guard. "I'm Mike," he added, his smile never wavering. "I'm your neighbor. I didn't realize you were out there last night, but I'm glad you heard me play." Something about the way he spoke made me feel like he wasn't just introducing himself. It felt like he was extending a hand, inviting me into a world that felt so different from the one I had been living in. I wasn't sure if I should step forward or retreat. The distance between us was not just physical but emotional, and yet there was an undeniable pull drawing me closer. "I heard," I said softly, my voice tinged with an emotion I couldn't place. "Your music. It was beautiful." Mike seemed to pause as though weighing my words. "I'm glad you think so," he said quietly. "I haven't played for anyone in a while. It's funny, I never expected to find an audience like this." I didn't know what to say to that. There was something in his tone, a subtle sadness behind his words, that made me feel like I wasn't the only one longing for something more. I wanted to ask him about his life, about why he played. But instead, I just stood there, caught in the unspoken connection between us. The conversation drifted naturally after that. We talked about trivial things, the weather, the neighborhood, a few casual pleasantries. But under the surface, there was something unspoken, something that hung between us, drawing us together without words. I had known him for only a few minutes, but already it felt like I had known him forever. As we spoke, I realized that this simple encounter, a chance meeting really, was more significant to me than I cared to admit. There was a magnetism in Mike that I couldn't ignore, a depth I could sense in him even though we had only exchanged a handful of words. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something stirring in me, something beyond the numb routine of my life with John. Before I knew it, the conversation was over, and Mike had to go inside. He smiled once more, that same warm smile, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of longing as he turned and walked back toward his house. But even as he disappeared from my view, I knew that something had shifted. I wasn't sure what this connection was or where it would lead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this strange, unexpected meeting, had opened a door to something I hadn't even known I was missing. After that day, I found myself hoping for more of those accidental encounters. It wasn't just the conversation that lingered, but the feeling of something more, something real, that I hadn't felt in a long time. Mike's presence, his kindness, had struck a chord deep within me. We started running into each other more often, in the yard, by the mailbox, sometimes just passing on the sidewalk. Each meeting felt like a spark, lighting a fire that I wasn't sure how to handle. The conversations were never long, but they felt significant. There was always this unspoken understanding, a connection that neither of us could fully explain. I began finding excuses to go outside, hoping for another chance to see him. Each time we spoke, I felt that tug, that pull. With every encounter, it became harder to ignore the feeling that there was something more than friendship growing between us. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but I could feel myself getting closer to him, drawn in by the quiet moments we shared. I didn't know what would come of it, but I knew I couldn't deny it any longer. Each meeting left me wanting more, and for the first time in a long time, I was eager for something real, something beyond the routine. As our encounters became more frequent, the line between friendship and something deeper began to blur. With every conversation, I could feel myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. Mike's easy smile, his laughter, the way he listened as if every word I said mattered. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. But as I grew closer to him, I couldn't ignore the weight of guilt settling in my chest. I was married to John. We hadn't been the same for a long time, but that didn't change the fact that I had made a vow to him. I tried to push away the feelings I was having, telling myself that this was nothing more than a fleeting connection, a passing distraction. But with every stolen moment with Mike, the more I realized how empty I had been for so long. I had been living in a fog, too afraid to face the growing distance between John and me. And now, Mike's presence was like a breath of fresh air in that suffocating silence. The more I talked to him, the more I realized that I didn't just want his company. I needed it. I needed something more than the quiet, predictable life I had with John. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a phase, just a moment of weakness. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The more I saw Mike, the more I felt something stirring inside me that I couldn't ignore. The guilt was there, yes, but it was quickly being overshadowed by the intense pull I felt toward him. I couldn't stop thinking about him, the conversations, the laughter, the way he made me feel alive. It was everything I had been missing, and as much as I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, I knew it was something I could no longer deny. It was a Saturday evening when the tension finally became unbearable. John had suggested inviting Mike and his wife over for dinner, a casual gesture that felt entirely out of place given the undercurrent of emotions swirling beneath the surface. I agreed, though I knew it would be awkward. It was impossible to ignore the tension that had built up between Mike and me, the words we hadn't spoken but both felt. That night, we sat around the dinner table trying to act normal. John chatted with Mike's wife, while Mike and I exchanged the occasional glance, each one loaded with unspoken words. The conversations around the table felt like static, an incoherent hum, while the space between Mike and I was thick with something unsaid. Every time I caught his eye, a rush of warmth would flood my chest, and I'd quickly look away, ashamed of the feelings I couldn't suppress. John didn't notice, or if he didn't acknowledge it. He was too caught up in the surface-level interactions, too unaware of the unspoken tension. But I could feel it. The space between my life with John and the life I was starting to imagine with Mike. It was too much to ignore. The way Mike smiled at me, the way his words lingered in the air long after he spoke. It was like we were two people caught in a silent dance, aware of each other in a way that no one else could see. By the time the evening ended, I could hardly look at John. I didn't know how to keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew that my heart had started to belong to someone else. As we said our goodbyes, I caught Mike's eye one last time. There was no need for words. He knew. I knew. And I was terrified of what that realization meant for my marriage, for my life. That night, lying in bed beside John, I couldn't shake the image of Mike's face. The silence between John and me felt more suffocating than ever before, and the weight of the truth pressed down on me. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. A few days later, the truth came crashing down. It wasn't a loud confrontation, no dramatic outburst or accusations. It was quieter, sharper, like a thread being pulled and unraveling everything at once. John was different that evening. His usual tired silence had shifted, replaced by a quiet intensity that I couldn't quite place. He had been watching me, I realized, watching the subtle changes in me, the way I'd started to withdraw, the way my eyes would light up when I talked about something, or someone else. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady, but filled with something darker, something hurt. "I don't know how, but I know." I didn't know what to say. The guilt that had been building for weeks, months, now flooded through me. I wanted to deny it, to pretend that I had been imagining things, that there was no one else, but the words stuck in my throat. "I'm sorry," I whispered, barely able to meet his eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like this." He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw all the years of our life together reflected in his eyes. The love, the shared moments, and now the betrayal. It hurt more than I had expected, more than I had prepared for, but even as he stood there, I knew there was no going back. John didn't shout. He didn't accuse me. Instead, he quietly packed a bag and left. I watched him go, my heart a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief because the weight of pretending was finally gone. But devastation because I knew, deep down, that I had just shattered the life I had built. As the door closed behind him, the silence in the house was deafening. There was no longer a routine, no longer a predictable rhythm. I was left with the mess of my choices, the consequences of seeking something beyond what I had. Mike was still out there, but I couldn't bring myself to reach out to him just yet. My mind was consumed by what had just happened, the life I had built and the life I had destroyed. I was alone. But more than that, I was awake. For the first time in years, I could feel everything. The weight of the emptiness, the weight of the consequences, but also the weight of the truth that now hung heavy between me and the silence that stretched out before me. Days passed, and the quiet of my home felt both suffocating and liberating. It was as though I was caught between two worlds, the life I had left behind and the uncertain future that stretched before me. John was gone. The house, once filled with the hum of our daily routine, was now eerily silent. His absence felt like a physical ache, but also, strangely, a kind of freedom. I found myself standing at the window, staring out at the street below, wondering what would come next. I had never imagined my life would unfold like this. I had never thought I would leave the safety of the life I knew, no matter how distant it had become. Yet here I was, standing on the precipice of a new, unfamiliar world. Mike. I hadn't seen him since that night. I thought of him often, of the way his presence had stirred something deep inside me, but I wasn't sure how to approach him now, or if I even should. It felt like too much had changed, too much had unraveled, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what had become of my life, or if I even deserved another chance at connection. But something inside me told me I couldn't turn away from what I had started. I had lived in the shadows for too long, hiding from the truth of my own desires. Now the truth was all that was left. I walked outside. My steps were slow at first, hesitant, but the closer I got to Mike's house, the more determined I became. I couldn't keep running from what I felt, from the pull that had never truly faded. When I reached his door, I paused. The fear was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't the fear of being caught, of losing everything, but the fear of facing the unknown, of letting someone new into the shattered pieces of my life. I knocked, and when he opened the door, our eyes met, and for the first time in days, I felt something inside me stir again. Not just longing, but hope.